Hello everyone. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sending you more stories like this. Now, let's begin. February in the Cascades seemed like a great idea when I planned it from my small apartment in Seattle. My sister had just gotten engaged. My job at the insurance company was draining whatever energy I had left, and turning another year older in a cubicle felt like a slow death. Maybe I needed to prove something to myself, prove I could still do hard things, that I was more than spreadsheets, deadlines, and endless conference calls. The weather forecast showed clear skies for the weekend, and I had hiked Snow Peak Trail twice before in summer. 10 miles in, 10 miles out. Easy enough. I packed my gear Friday night, told my roommate Alicia I'd be back Sunday evening, and left before dawn on Saturday. When I pulled into the trailhead parking lot and saw it was completely empty, it should have been my first warning. Instead, I took it as good luck. The entire mountain, quiet and untouched, all to myself. The first 3 miles were exactly what I needed. Cold air burning my lungs, snow crunching under my boots, and a silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped. Pine trees lined the trail like frozen sentries, their branches sagging under heavy snow. Around 9 in the morning, I stopped to eat a granola bar and check my phone. No signal, but I'd already downloaded the offline map. Everything looked perfect. The sky was that impossible shade of winter blue, bright enough to hurt your eyes. My head felt clearer than it had in months, maybe years. I took a few pictures, tightened my backpack straps, and kept moving. By late morning, clouds began gathering over the western ridge. They looked distant, nothing serious, so I kept going. That was my second mistake, the one that nearly killed me. The storm arrived faster than anything I'd ever seen. One moment I was walking beneath scattered clouds. 15 minutes later, the sky turned the color of wet concrete. The temperature dropped sharply. My cheeks went numb in seconds. I stopped to pull on my balaclava and extra gloves, struggling with my pack's zipper as the first flakes began to fall. They weren't the soft movie scene snowflakes. These hit hard and fast, whipped sideways by a brutal wind that came from nowhere. Within minutes, I could barely see 20 feet ahead. The trail markers, the small orange flags tied to branches, vanished into a white wall. I pulled out my phone to check the map again, but my fingers were stiff in my gloves, and moisture made the screen glitch with phantom touches. I finally got my bearings. I was about 4 miles from the trailhead, maybe 4.5. I needed to turn back immediately. But turning back in a storm like that wasn't simple. Visibility dropped to near zero, and every direction looked identical. The trail disappeared under rapidly accumulating snow. I tried following my footprints, but they filled in almost instantly, fading into shapeless depressions, rocks, roots, anything. The wind made thinking difficult. It wasn't just cold, it was loud. It roared in my ears like a constant warning. I picked the direction that felt right and started walking, reminding myself that moving downhill would eventually lead me to the road. Water flows down, trails follow water. Roads follow trails. Stay calm and keep moving. But after 20 minutes, the ground began sloping upward again. I'd gone the wrong way, deeper into the wilderness instead of out. That's when I saw them. Footprints. At first, my mind tried to make them fit into something reasonable. Maybe I'd doubled back by accident. Maybe they were mine. But they were too fresh, edges too sharp. And they weren't behind me. They were beside me. A second set of boot prints, running parallel to mine, about 5 feet to my left. I froze. Snow was falling so heavily that any tracks should have been half covered in minutes, but these looked newly made clean, defined, deliberate. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the white void around me. Nothing. Just trees, snow, and that relentless wind. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but my voice sounded small, swallowed instantly by the storm. No response. I looked again at the prints, larger than mine. Different tread pattern. Someone else was out here. Someone who had been walking right next to me without making a sound. The logical part of my brain tried to calm me. Maybe another hiker got caught in the storm. Maybe they followed my tracks hoping for help. That would make sense. 2 people have a better chance of surviving than 1. But if that were true, why didn't they call out? Why stay out of sight, matching my pace, staying close enough to leave prints beside mine, but never close enough to see? I started walking again, faster this time. Every few steps I forced myself to look down. The prints stayed with me, left, right, perfectly aligned with my own steps. Whoever it was, they weren't falling behind or moving ahead. They were staying exactly parallel to me. Once, I stopped mid-step, holding my foot raised. And I swear I heard a faint crunch in the snow to my left, the sound of someone else freezing in place at the same time. Then nothing. I lowered my foot and kept moving. The prints continued as if nothing had changed. I don't know how long I walked like that. Time dissolves when you're freezing and terrified. Minutes, maybe hours. Snow kept falling, wind kept howling, and those prints kept forming beside mine with mechanical precision. Eventually, I noticed they weren't running parallel anymore. They were angling inward, degree by degree, guiding me subtly left. I hadn't realized it was happening until I checked my phone again. The compass showed I was now heading northwest instead of south, deeper into the backcountry. Further from the road. Whoever was out there wasn't just following me. They were hurting me. A wave of anger cut through the fear. I wasn't going to die because someone wanted to play games. I forced myself to think. The wind was blowing from the west. If I kept it on my right cheek, I'd be heading south. Simple. I adjusted my path and walked deliberately, ignoring the prints. I refused to look at them. But they changed too. They moved in front of me, crossing my path diagonally, forcing me either to step over them or veer left. Every correction I made was blocked by new prints appearing ahead, diverting me again. It felt like walking through a maze being built around me in real time. I stopped and screamed into the storm, rage, fear, desperation, all of it shredding my throat. I demanded whoever was out there to show themselves. The wind devoured my voice. But for a brief second, the snow thinned, and I saw a figure standing between two pine trees. Tall. Dark clothing. Hood up. Arms at their sides. Perfectly still. Watching me. Then the snow swallowed them, and they were gone. Seeing them broke something inside me, but it also woke something up. This was real. Not imagination. Not hypothermia. Someone was out there, and they weren't trying to help. I pulled the small canister of bear spray from my pocket. It wasn't much, but it was something. I held it tight and pushed forward as fast as I could without running. Running in deep snow would have exhausted me, and I needed whatever energy I had left. My legs burned. My lungs ached. I kept the wind on my right cheek, refusing to look at the ground. I didn't want to see how close the prints were. I counted my steps to stay focused. Around count 300, the trees suddenly opened, and I nearly walked straight off a ravine edge. I stumbled backward, grabbing a branch that tore through my glove and into my skin. Below was a steep drop of maybe 30 feet, a frozen creek at the bottom. I looked left and right. The ravine stretched in both directions, a dead end. They had guided me here on purpose. I spun around, expecting the figure to appear. Nothing, only snow and silence. But the footprints were there, leading right up to me, stopping just 10 feet away. Fresh. Crisp. Waiting. Something in me snapped into clarity. Instead of running along the edge like they expected, I chose the one option they wouldn't anticipate. I climbed down. There was a section off to the right where the slope wasn't sheer. I shoved the bear spray away, turned to face the incline, and climbed down backward. Ice-coated rocks made every grip uncertain. Twice my foot slipped and I slid several feet, scraping against stone. But I kept going. Halfway down, I heard something above me, not the wind. Footsteps. Fast, coming to the ravine's edge. I didn't look. I just moved. My arms shook from effort, my fingers numb. When I finally reached the bottom, I hit the frozen creek hard. The ice cracked beneath me but held. I scrambled up and looked toward the ridge. A figure stood at the edge, tall, hooded, broad-shouldered. Still, watching me. Snow thinned just enough that I could see him clearly for the first time. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his eyes on me. We stared at each other. Neither of us moved. Then he stepped back and vanished. Minutes passed. No movement. No sign of him climbing down another way. The storm raged above, but inside the ravine, the walls blocked the worst of the wind. For the first time in hours, my thoughts were my own. I pulled out my phone. No signal. But the compass still worked, and creeks lead downhill. Downhill meant civilization. I followed the frozen creek, walking until the ravine walls lowered and trees thinned. Eventually, I saw the faint gray line of a road. I stumbled onto the shoulder, barely standing. About 20 minutes later, a pickup truck pulled over. The driver, an older man named Earl from the county maintenance crew, said, "I look like a ghost." He wrapped me in a blanket and blasted the heat. I tried to explain, but the words came out broken from shaking. At the ranger station, they took my statement and sent a search team the next morning. They found my tracks, the point where I descended, the creek I followed, but no other footprints. The storm had erased everything. Or maybe there was nothing left to find. A ranger gently suggested hypothermia, hallucinations, confusion. I nodded, but I knew better. I filed a police report. Nothing came of it. I never returned to Snow Peak Trail. I haven't hiked alone since. And sometimes, when wind howls outside my apartment window, I think about that figure in the storm. I think about what would have happened if I hadn't climbed down that ravine. I think about where he was trying to lead me. And I think about this. Somewhere out there, maybe right now, he's standing at the edge of another empty trailhead, watching another woman lace her boots and step into the white with no idea he's there. Night shifts at a 24-hour laundromat teach you things about people that daylight never will. What happened to me on a Thursday in February still makes me check the locks twice before settling behind the counter. I've been working at Sudsy's Coin Wash on Belmont Road in Columbus, Ohio for about 8 months by then, a job I picked up after dropping out of community college the previous spring when paying rent became more urgent than earning credits. The place was nothing special. 20 industrial washers, 8 dryers, fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry insects, and a tiny back office where I spent most nights watching Netflix on my phone and helping the occasional customer whose machine ate their quarters. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and most nights I saw maybe 4 or 5 people total. That Thursday, the forecast warned of a polar vortex pushing temperatures down to -20, the kind of cold that kills homeless people and cracks car batteries in half. By 2003 in the morning, the laundromat was completely empty. The wind outside howled against the plate glass windows so violently I kept expecting them to shatter inward. I had just finished mopping the floor near the folding tables when I noticed a woman standing outside the front door, her face pressed to the glass, her breath leaving small clouds that vanished instantly in the brutal air. She wore a thin jacket, something closer to spring weather than life-threatening cold, and no gloves. Her fingers were red, almost purple at the tips, and she shivered so violently I could see her entire body trembling through the door. When our eyes met, she raised a hand in a weak wave and pointed at the handle. Company policy was clear. After midnight, the door stayed locked, and customers had to use the buzzer. But looking at this woman, maybe late 40s, graying hair plastered to her forehead, desperation carved into every line of her face, I knew I couldn't leave her outside to freeze. I walked over, unlocked the door, and she practically fell inside, a wave of frozen air rushing in behind her that made me gasp. She thanked me in a voice barely above a whisper, words cracking like ice splitting on a pond. Her name was Renee. Her car had broken down a mile up the road, she said. She'd been walking, trying to find anywhere open with heat. Her phone was dead. She held it up like proof, and all she needed was warmth and a way to call her brother. It all made sense. I told her she could sit in the plastic chairs near the dryers, where the residual heat made that corner the warmest part of the building. I even offered her the cup of coffee I'd been nursing, which she accepted with trembling hands. Watching her wrap her fingers around that styrofoam cup, I felt good about my decision. Basic human decency. You don't let someone die of hypothermia because of a policy written by someone who had never worked a night shift. For the next 20 minutes, things were calm. She sat quietly, sipping coffee, color slowly returning to her cheeks. When she asked if she could use the phone in my office to call her brother, I told her yes, and led her to the back. The office was tiny metal desk, rolling chair, a safe bolted to the floor, and a corded phone older than I was. She dialed, spoke briefly to a man on the other end, hung up, and told me her brother was about 15 minutes away. She thanked me again, though her eyes drifted across the office, lingering on the safe, the drawers, the security monitor. I assumed she was just disoriented or curious. I walked her back to her seat and returned to the counter. 10 minutes passed. Then the buzzer rang. I looked at the security monitor and saw a man standing outside, hands buried in his coat pockets, shoulders hunched against the wind, tall, maybe 6'3" or 6'4", with a shaved head and a thick beard crusted with frost. I assumed the brother had arrived faster than expected. I glanced at Renee. She was already standing, walking toward the door, but something about her movement tightened something inside my chest. She wasn't relieved or excited, just steady, casual, and she kept her eyes on me, not him. I pressed the button. The man stepped inside, stamping his boots, blowing into his cupped hands. He nodded once, no greeting, no thank you, and walked straight past the counter to Renee. They spoke quietly, too softly for me to hear, but the lack of warmth between them was unmistakable. No hug. No thank God you're okay. Nothing even resembling family. They stood close, heads bent toward each other like conspirators, and every few seconds one of them glanced toward me. Subtle, but not subtle enough. I tried to focus on my phone, scrolling without seeing anything. The unease crawled up my spine, cold and persistent. The man broke away from her and walked toward me, each step loud against the linoleum. He stopped at the counter close enough for me to smell stale cigarette smoke and something sour beneath it, and asked if there was a bathroom he could use. I pointed to the short hallway near the back, but he didn't turn. Instead, he leaned forward on the counter, thick forearms pressing into it, and asked if the bathroom was near that office he'd seen earlier. My stomach dropped. The way he said it, that office, made it clear he'd been paying attention since the moment he walked in. I told him the bathroom was on the left, the office on the right, and that the office stayed locked. He smiled. It didn't reach his pale gray eyes. Then he finally turned and disappeared down the hallway. Renee appeared at the counter almost instantly, leaning in too close, her breath warming the cold air between us. That's when I noticed the thin scar through her left eyebrow, something I hadn't seen before. She asked if I was alone tonight. The question hit me like a shock of electricity. I lied without hesitation. Told her my manager was in the back doing inventory and would be out soon. Something flickered across her face. Annoyance, maybe calculation. She asked what time my shift ended and when the next worker arrived. I lied again, told her 7, told her my coworker always showed up early. She nodded slowly and walked away. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my teeth. They weren't stranded. They weren't siblings. They were here for something, and I was finally understanding what that something was. The man returned, but instead of heading back to Renee, he walked straight to the office door and tried the handle. Just like that. No excuse, no hesitation. He rattled it twice, then turned to me and said he thought he left his phone in there when his sister made the call. The lie was pathetic. I told him no. Only the morning manager had the key. Another lie. I had the key in my pocket, but I delivered it flat and confident. He stared at me, jaw tightening beneath his beard. Then he walked back to Renee, and they whispered urgently. I slid my phone out beneath the counter, my hands shaking. I opened the non-emergency police number I'd saved months earlier and hit call. The man walked back to the office door and slammed his shoulder into it. The wood groaned. Renee moved toward the entrance, blocking my only way out. "Columbus Police, how can I help you?" the dispatcher said, her voice tired and bored. I whispered my location. Told her 2 people were trying to break into the office. Told her I was alone, told her I was scared. She told me to stay on the line. Officers were on the way. The man hit the door again, harder. A sharp crack split through the laundromat. The frame was giving way. Renee snapped her head toward him, then toward me. She knew I'd called. She had to. And the look she gave me, cold, calculating, nothing like the desperate, shivering woman I'd let inside, told me the situation was about to turn. She said something sharp to the man, one word. He stopped ramming the door. For a moment, everything froze. The buzzing lights, the wind rattling the windows, the dispatcher's voice in my ear. Then the man reached into his coat. My whole body locked. But he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a phone. He checked the screen, muttered something to Renee. She cursed, clear, loud, angry. Sirens. Faint at first, then growing. He shoved his phone away and strode toward the front door, boots thundering with purpose. Renee followed, pausing only once to stare at me. Not angry, not panicked, just memorizing me. Then she stepped into the frozen dark. The police arrived 3 minutes later. 2 cruisers, lights painting the parking lot in flashing red and blue. I let them in with trembling hands and told them everything. They searched, found nothing. No abandoned car. No footprints. The wind had erased every trace. They examined the cracked doorframe and told me I'd done the right thing. One officer, a woman with short gray hair, told me this wasn't the first time. Teams of 2. One plays the victim to gain entry. One arrives later to do the heavy work. They target isolated businesses during extreme weather, counting on sympathy and the kind of exhaustion that makes night shift workers careless. She told me I was lucky. I quit 2 weeks later. Gave notice the next morning when my manager walked in and saw the splintered doorframe and the police report and me sitting silently with a cold cup of coffee I hadn't touched. Day shifts only since then. Warehouses. Noise. People everywhere. Jobs where you are never truly alone. It has been years, and I still think about that night. Every time the temperature drops below 0. Every time news reports mention people freezing to death. Every time someone knocks after midnight. I remember Renee's face against the glass, her trembling hands. The performance that fooled me completely. I don't blame myself. Most people would have helped her. But I learned something that night. Something that has never left me. Kindness can be a door. And there are people who spend their lives looking for someone willing to open it. My commute home from the warehouse usually takes about 30 minutes. But that night in January, it dragged closer to an hour because the roads were sheets of ice. I had just turned 30 a week before, and my wife had been telling me, begging me, really, to find a job closer to home, something that didn't require driving through rural stretches of frozen road at 11 at night. She was right, of course. She usually is. But the pay was good, and we had just bought our first house, so 5 nights a week I made that lonely drive through back roads that barely got any county maintenance in winter. That Wednesday, the temperature had dropped to around 10 degrees. My truck's heater was fighting a losing battle, blowing warm air that felt instantly swallowed by the cold creeping through the windows. I was exhausted, the kind that settles into your bones after loading trucks for 10 hours straight. All I wanted was to get home, kiss my wife, and collapse into bed. I was about 2 miles from home, moving along a stretch of road that cut between old farmland and dense patches of black, silent woods, when I saw the figure on the shoulder. At first I thought it was a deer, the way the shape wavered in my headlights, but then arms started waving, frantic and desperate, and I realized it was a person. A woman, maybe in her 20s or early 30s, wearing a thin, dark coat that looked laughably inadequate for weather like this. She stood beside an old Chevy sedan with the hood popped open, both hands swinging in wide arcs like she was drowning, and I was the only lifeline in sight. Now, I grew up in a small town. My parents taught me to help people when they needed it. Out here, with no cell service and temperatures that could kill you in a couple of hours, leaving someone stranded wasn't something I could live with. So I slowed, pulled over about 40 feet ahead of her car, and switched on my hazards. For a moment, I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, watching her jog toward my truck in the rearview mirror. Something in my gut tightened, but I forced myself to ignore it. She reached the passenger window and I rolled it down halfway. The cold rushed in immediately, sharp enough to bite. Up close, she looked younger than I thought, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair tied in a messy ponytail. Her face was raw from the cold, her teeth chattering so hard her words vibrated. She told me her car had died an hour ago, that she'd been waiting in the freezing dark hoping someone would pass by. She said her phone was dead, and she needed a ride to her brother's place, just a few miles down the road. She pointed vaguely into the darkness ahead, far beyond where my headlights reached. I asked if she wanted me to take a look at her car, maybe try to jump it, but she shook her head quickly, too quickly, insisting the engine had been dying for weeks and finally gave out for good. Something about the way she said it, fast, dismissive, almost rehearsed, made me pause. But she looked genuinely cold, genuinely desperate, and the idea of leaving her there felt impossible. So I unlocked the door and told her to get in. She slid into the seat, leaning forward immediately, rubbing her hands over the vents. She smelled like cigarettes and something else, something sour and unfamiliar. I asked her for the exact directions to her brother's place. She rattled off a route that took us off the main road and onto a smaller one I'd never used before. I knew the area well enough to know that a few old properties were sprinkled out there, long driveways hidden behind clusters of trees. It didn't seem unreasonable. But the second I turned onto that narrow road, the pavement changed. The ice was thicker, darker. There were no tire tracks ahead of us, no sign anyone had driven through recently. The woods closed in tight on both sides, branches scraping the sides of my truck like fingers. I slowed to maybe 10 miles an hour because my headlights seemed to dissolve before they even touched the road ahead. That was when she said, "Keep going, just a little further." Her voice wasn't shaky anymore. It wasn't scared. It was flat. Calm. Something about the tone made a chill crawl down my spine. I glanced over at her. She wasn't rubbing her hands anymore. They rested still on her thighs. The shivering had stopped too, which made no sense because the heater in my truck barely warmed anything, not even me, and I'd been sitting in it all night. I asked how much further. She said one word, "Soon." Nothing else. No landmarks, no reassurance. Just soon. My grip tightened on the wheel. I replayed every turn in my head, realizing how far we'd traveled from the main road. Maybe 2 miles. Maybe more. No houses. No lights. No signs of life. Just darkness, ice, and this woman who suddenly felt like a stranger wearing someone else's face. I thought about my wife at home, probably asleep, unaware I was deep in the woods with a woman I didn't know, on a road I'd never taken. A road no one would think to search. Then I saw him. On the left side of the road, maybe 30 feet ahead, a figure stood at the tree line, perfectly still. Watching us. A man, judging by the build, dressed in dark clothes that melted into the shadows. I saw him only because something reflective, maybe a zipper caught in my headlights for a split second. I didn't say anything. My jaw clenched. My eyes flicked from the road to the mirrors and back again. Then I saw another one. This time on the right side, further back, but unmistakably a person. Standing, waiting, facing the road. My heartbeat hammered so hard I could hear it over the engine. I looked at the woman. She still stared straight ahead, blank and calm, like she was waiting for something specific to happen. That was the moment I knew, deep in my bones, that I had driven straight into something planned, something wrong, something I was never meant to walk away from. I didn't think. I reacted. I slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded violently, fishtailing before I regained control. The woman snapped her head toward me, grabbing the dashboard. Her expression wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was anger. Cold, sharp anger, like I'd ruined something she'd spent a long time preparing. Before she could speak, I threw the truck into reverse and hit the gas. The tires spun for a moment before catching. She lunged for my arm, nails digging through my jacket, yelling for me to stop, telling me I was making a mistake. But her voice wasn't soft or scared anymore. It was harsh, commanding. I shook her off and kept reversing, my eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the narrowing road, trying not to slide off into the trees. Branches scraped along the truck, loud and frantic. Something moved in the woods, a cluster of shadows pulling forward in jerky, unnatural motions. Getting closer. She grabbed the steering wheel then, trying to jerk it out of my hands. I shoved her off with my elbow harder than I intended, sending her into the passenger door with a grunt. For a brief second, our eyes met, and in that second I saw nothing human. Not fear, not panic, just frustration. Like I was a task she'd failed. With one hand gripping the wheel, I reached across her, yanked the door handle, and shoved the door open. Cold air whipped inside. She clung to the seat, screaming now, her voice sharp and furious. I pushed again, harder, and she spilled out onto the icy road, rolling into the dark. I didn't look to see if she got up. I slammed the door shut and continued reversing until the road widened enough for a turn. Figures surged out from the woods, 3, maybe 4, sprinting toward the truck. They were close, far too close. But I spun the wheel, floored the gas, and shot forward. The truck fishtailed, the back end sliding dangerously close to a tree, but I corrected and kept going. The drive back to the main road felt endless. My eyes locked on the thin ribbon of pavement illuminated by my headlights. Every patch of ice felt like a trap waiting to spin me around. Every shadow felt alive. When the main road finally appeared, I exhaled a broken sound, part sob, part laugh. I didn't slow down. I didn't check the mirrors again. I drove 20 over the speed limit all the way home, praying the route stayed empty. When I pulled into my driveway, I couldn't move. I sat with the engine running, hands shaking, heart pounding, staring at my quiet house. I didn't tell my wife anything that night. She was half asleep when I crawled into bed, and I just held her until the sun came up. The next morning, I called in sick. I had to see it again in daylight, had to know I wasn't losing my mind. But when I reached the spot where her car had been, there was nothing. No Chevy. No footprints, no tire marks. No broken glass. No sign anyone had been there at all. I drove down the narrow road again. In daylight, it looked harmless. Peaceful even. But a mile in, I found a clearing hidden behind a wall of brush. The ground was torn up by tire tracks. Dozens of them. Fresh. I didn't get out of the truck. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what that place was. I went to the police that afternoon, spent hours explaining everything. They wrote it down, told me they'd look into it. Weeks passed. Months. Nothing. No calls back. No updates. It was like the whole thing never happened. But I know what I saw. I know what those people were waiting for. And every time I think about what would have happened if I'd driven even a minute further, my stomach twists. I don't take that road anymore. I added 20 minutes to my commute just to avoid anything unlit, anything remote. My wife knows the full story now. She cried when I told her. She made me promise to find another job. I'm still working on that. But the worst part is this. When I see someone stranded on the roadside now, hazards blinking in the dark, I keep driving. I hate myself for it, but I can't stop. I'll never stop. Not after that night. Because I know now that some people out there count on your kindness. They use it as bait. And the only reason I made it home was luck. Just luck. And that thought keeps me awake more than anything. Hours into a haul across the Dalton Highway in February, you start questioning every decision that led you there. My graduating class back in 2012 had gone off to college, to office jobs, to lives with central heating and weekends off. And there I was, gripping a steering wheel at 2 a.m. while the Arctic tried its best to kill me. I drove freight for Kenworth Logistics out of Fairbanks, running loads up to Prudhoe Bay during the winter season when the ice roads opened and the money got good enough to make a man forget common sense. On this run, I was hauling drilling equipment worth more than I'd make in 5 years, creeping along at 20 miles an hour because the whiteout had turned the world into a wall of static. My rig was a Peterbilt 389 I'd named Rosemary after my grandmother, and she was the only thing between me and a frozen death in a ditch. The heater blasted on full. The wipers fought a losing battle against the snow. And somewhere behind all that white nothing, the sun wouldn't rise for another 6 hours. I had made this run maybe 30 times over 3 winters, and I had never seen conditions this bad. The radio had been giving me trouble since I passed Coldfoot, crackling in and out like someone was playing with the dial from the other side. I kept trying to reach dispatch. Kept trying to raise any of the other drivers who might be out on the road that night. But all I got was bursts of static punctuated by silence. The isolation up there is something people who have never driven those roads will never understand. There is nothing for miles in every direction except tundra and ice and the occasional frozen creek bed. No cell service, no rest stops, no farmhouses with their lights on. Just the road, your headlights, and the howling wind that rocks your trailer like it's trying to tip you over. I had a satellite phone for emergencies, but when I checked it, the screen showed no signal, which was unusual because those things were supposed to work anywhere. I told myself the storm was interfering with the satellite, told myself it would clear up in an hour or two. That was when I first saw the figure standing on the shoulder of the road, maybe 40 feet ahead, right at the edge of my headlight's reach. I eased off the accelerator and let Rosemary slow down on her own, not wanting to brake hard on ice. I couldn't see beneath the packed snow. The figure didn't move, just stood there facing the road. As I got closer, I could make out more details. A dark parka with a fur-lined hood, no visible face. Hands hanging at the sides, no vehicle anywhere nearby. No snowmobile, Nothing to explain how a person could be out there in the middle of a whiteout at 2 in the morning, 50 miles from the nearest warm building. My first thought was that someone had broken down and walked until they couldn't walk anymore, that I was looking at a stranded driver minutes away from freezing to death. I started to pull over, my foot hovering over the brake, already running through the procedure in my head. Get them in the cab, crank the heat, radio for help once the signal came back. But something made me hesitate. The person wasn't waving, not flagging me down, not doing any of the things you'd expect from someone desperate for rescue. They just stood there motionless like a mannequin someone had planted in the snow as a sick joke. I crept past at maybe 10 miles an hour, close enough that my headlights should have lit up their face, but the hood was angled down and all I could see was shadow. My side mirror caught the figure as I passed. Still motionless, still facing the road like they were waiting for something. I told myself to stop, told myself that leaving someone out there was the same as leaving them to die. But my hands wouldn't turn the wheel. There was something wrong about the way they stood. Something unnatural about that perfect stillness in a wind gusting hard enough to rock my trailer. I watched the mirror as the figure shrank behind me, swallowed by the whiteout, and a heavy guilt settled in my chest. I grabbed the radio and tried again, hoping to report the sighting to someone, anyone. But all I got was that same dead static. The satellite phone still showed no signal. I was completely alone out there, and I had just driven past what might have been a dying person because something in my gut told me not to stop. About 15 minutes later, the engine temperature gauge started creeping toward the red. Rosemary had never overheated on me before, not once in 3 years, and I knew immediately something was wrong. I pulled over to the shoulder and killed the engine, listening to the wind scream against the cab while I waited for the temperature to drop. The protocol was simple. Let it cool, check the coolant, restart, and monitor. I had done it 100 times on other rigs, though never in conditions like this. Never when stopping meant exposing myself to air cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under a minute. I zipped my parka all the way up, pulled on my insulated gloves, and grabbed the flashlight. The moment I opened the door, the cold hit me like a physical wall, stealing my breath and making my eyes water instantly. I climbed down and walked to the front of the rig, the flashlight beam barely cutting through the swirling white. The coolant reservoir looked fine. The hoses were intact. No leaks, no loose fittings. Nothing to explain the temperature spike. Probably a sensor issue, I told myself. Something electrical glitching in the cold. I was about to climb back into the cab when I noticed the footprints. They were on the passenger side of the truck. A single line of boot prints in the fresh snow, leading from somewhere behind me toward the trailer. My flashlight followed them along the length of the rig, and they stopped right at the back doors. Like whoever made them had walked up and then just vanished. The snow was falling hard enough that any prints would have been covered in minutes, which meant these were fresh. Made sometime in the last few minutes. While I sat in the cab, I stared at them, my breath coming in thick white clouds, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no one around. I hadn't heard anything. No footsteps. No knocking, no voices. The road behind me was empty. The road ahead was empty. But someone had walked up to my trailer while I sat inside completely unaware and then disappeared without a trace. I thought of the figure on the road, the one I had passed not 20 minutes earlier, and a cold that had nothing to do with the weather settled into my bones. I walked toward the back of the trailer, flashlight raised, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the wheels. The footprints led right to the double doors and stopped there, but the seal on the trailer was still intact. The metal lock I'd secured back in Fairbanks was exactly where I had left it, frozen solid. Whoever had walked up here hadn't tried to break in, hadn't tried to steal anything. They had stood there, and then disappeared. I circled the trailer slowly, checking every shadow, every gap between the wheels, but there was no one. The wind howled and the snow swirled, and I was completely alone. I thought about following the footprints backward, tracing them to wherever they came from, but the idea of walking away from the rig made my chest tight with fear. I hurried back into the cab, locked both doors, and sat there breathing hard. I tried the radio again. Nothing. Just static. The engine had cooled enough to restart, so I fired up Rosemary and pulled back onto the road, pushing the speed as high as I dared. Every few seconds I checked my mirrors, watching for movement in the white wall behind me. I drove maybe 10 miles before I noticed something wrong. The trailer was swaying. Not the normal push from wind gusts, but a rhythmic, deliberate swaying, like something inside was shifting its weight. I knew what I was hauling. Crates of machine parts strapped to pallets. Nothing that could move on its own. Nothing that should make the trailer sway like that. And then it moved again. I wasn't going to stop. That was the one thing I knew for certain. Whatever was happening back there, whoever was back there, they wanted me to stop. The figure on the road had been bait. The engine trouble had been a trap. This was another attempt to get me out of the cab and into the storm. I pushed the accelerator down. Rosemary surged forward. 30, 40, 40, 50, faster than anyone should drive on an ice road. Then the banging started. It came from the roof of the cab directly above me. A heavy rhythmic pounding. 3 hits. A pause. 3 more. Deliberate. Loud enough to vibrate the steering column. I jerked in my seat and nearly swerved off the road. Someone was on top of my truck. Someone who had been able to climb onto a moving rig without me seeing a thing. I floored the accelerator. The radio crackled suddenly, a distorted voice bleeding through the static for half a second before disappearing. I drove blind into the whiteout, hard pounding, trailer fishtailing, banging echoing above me. Sometimes it paused, sometimes it slid toward the back. Sometimes something scraped along the passenger window, a dark blur disappearing before my eyes could focus. Then, lights. Faint, warm, growling, dead horse. The exact second the lights appeared, the banging stopped. The swaying stopped. By the time I pulled into the lot and slammed the brakes, everything was silent. The workers found scratches on the roof. Deep gouges in the paint. A vent panel under the trailer pried open. Wet boot prints on the trailer floor, handprints on the walls. But no person, no tracks leading away. No explanation. They told me other drivers had reported similar things over the years. Figures on the road, damaged rigs, missing drivers. I quit ice road hauling after that run. But sometimes, when the wind picks up at night, I still hear it. 3 bangs. A pause. 3 more. Around 3 a.m. on a Thursday in February, I woke up because of the silence. Not a noise silence. Anyone who has lived through a real winter knows the difference. When you fall asleep with the heater humming, the refrigerator buzzing, the steady background of a house living its normal life, your brain gets used to that sound. It becomes part of how you sleep. So when everything suddenly goes dead at once, that absence is louder than any alarm. It felt like someone had yanked the entire world into a deeper, colder stillness. I sat up in bed immediately, already feeling the temperature drop in the room. My phone was on the nightstand, and when the screen lit up, it showed 3:02 a.m. and a battery barely above 40%. No service bars. The power was out. Judging by the cold already crawling through the air, it had been out for at least an hour. I pulled the blanket around my shoulders and sat there for a moment, unsure if I should get up or just wait until morning. The whole point of renting this place had been to finish the novel I'd been working on for 7 years, to escape the noise of Portland and give myself 4 quiet weeks alone. A friend of a friend owned this little cabin, if you could even call it that, 20 minutes outside the city, tucked at the end of a gravel road with only a few scattered houses along the way. My nearest neighbor was half a mile down. I had turned 33 the month before and decided it was now or never to get the book done. When I booked it, the idea of isolation felt peaceful. Out here in the dark, with no heat, no power, no phone signal, and no one around, it didn't feel peaceful at all. I switched on my phone's flashlight and scanned the room. Everything looked ordinary. My laptop on the desk, my suitcase in the corner, the window reflecting nothing but my own tired face. The silence was so complete it made me feel like I was underwater. I decided to check the rest of the house, mostly to make sure nothing had gone wrong with the plumbing. The owner had warned me the pipes could be temperamental in extreme cold. The last thing I needed was frozen water flooding the place. Swinging my legs out of bed was a mistake. The floor felt like ice beneath my socks. I shoved my feet into my boots without lacing them and held my flashlight steady as I moved down the short hallway. The house was tiny, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, an open living room and kitchen, and a mudroom by the back door. You could walk the whole thing in less than 10 seconds. The kitchen felt colder than the bedroom. Everything was still, the fridge silent, the stovetop cold. Out of habit, I flipped the light switch, forgetting there was no power. Nothing happened except the faint click of a dead switch. I paused and listened. Outside, the wind hit the walls in steady bursts, but inside there was no sound except my breathing and the soft creak of the floorboards under my weight. That was when I decided to check every window and door. Not because I was scared, at least that wasn't what I told myself, but because it seemed logical. With the power out across the area, the woods would be pitch black. No porch lights. No street lights. And I was a woman alone in a house I barely knew. Double-checking the locks felt like the responsible thing to do. The front door was secure. The 2 living room windows were latched. The tiny bathroom window was locked, too small for anyone to crawl through anyway. Bat left the back door in the mudroom. The mudroom was easily the coldest part of the house. I stepped inside, breath hanging in the air in a faint fog, and shined my light through the small window in the back door. I expected to see only snow. There was snow, but not the way it should have been. Something had disturbed the blanket of powder on the porch. Not footprints. Not animal tracks. The snow had been brushed aside in a sweeping arc, cleared carefully away from the door handle, like someone had wiped it clean with their arm. I leaned closer, staring at the pattern. Snow doesn't move like that on its own. The wind doesn't form perfect arcs, and the snow that slides off roofs falls straight down. This was different. The porch steps had depressions, too, soft impressions where someone had stepped. Not full footprints, because the snow was light and filling fast, but unmistakable marks of someone standing there. My chest tightened. I stepped back from the door, checking the deadbolt again, even though I already knew it was locked. My pulse hammered in my ears. Someone had been there recently, maybe within the last hour. Someone had walked up to the back door of the cabin, cleared the snow to see the handle clearly, and then, what? Just left? Backing out of the mudroom, I kept my light aimed at the door as if expecting it to suddenly swing open. I thought about calling 911, but my phone still had 0 signal. Nothing. Dead zone. I thought about my car out front. If I grabbed my keys, ran outside, and drove to the nearest lit building, I could get help. But that meant going into the dark, into the same snow someone else had already crossed, into a silence deep enough to hide anything. I turned off the flashlight to save battery and let my eyes adjust. The windows gave off a faint bluish glow from the snow outside, just enough to see the shapes of furniture. I tried to breathe as quietly as I could. For a few minutes, nothing happened. I was almost starting to believe I had overreacted, maybe a lost hiker, maybe a drunk wanderer, maybe anything harmless, when I heard it. A soft sound. From the mudroom. The unmistakable click of a door handle being tested. Slowly. Gently. Like someone trying to see if the lock would turn without making noise. I froze. The handle turned again. Then stopped. I pressed myself against the kitchen counter, barely breathing. The sound stopped, and I waited, counting the seconds in my head. 5. 10. 20. Nothing. Trying to shift my weight to get a better angle, I stepped on a floorboard that let out a loud creak. The sound from the back door went silent instantly. That was when I understood. Whoever was outside was listening for me. They knew I was awake. They knew where I was in the house. And they were waiting. My skin went cold. This wasn't a confused neighbor or someone seeking shelter. This was someone trying to get inside quietly. The footsteps started again, slow, deliberate moving along the side of the house. I could track the sound as they pressed through the snow, circling from the back toward the living room windows. I didn't dare move to look. I stayed perfectly still, following the sound as the person walked the length of the cabin, taking their time. The footsteps stopped near the front of the house. A minute passed, then another. I was starting to hope they had left when the front door handle rattled violently. No subtlety this time. Someone was trying to force it open. The whole door shook in its frame. The deadbolt held, but knowing the only thing between me and a stranger was a piece of wood suddenly didn't feel comforting at all. That was when I decided to move. Staying low, staying quiet, I made my way to the bedroom. I didn't turn on the flashlight. I didn't trust any noise or movement. I grabbed my car keys from my purse and the small kitchen knife I had used earlier to cut apples. It wasn't a weapon, but it felt better than nothing. I crouched beside the bed with my back to the wall, where no one could come up behind me, and held the knife so tightly my hand hurt. The rattling stopped after about 30 seconds. Silence returned. Thick, heavy silence. I don't know how long I stayed there. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, every shift of my own breathing sounded like a threat. At some point, I heard the footsteps again. This time moving away, crunching through the snow, growing fainter until there was nothing. But I didn't move. I didn't trust it. I kept thinking they were waiting somewhere out of view, waiting for me to stand up or look outside or unlock a door. The sky eventually shifted, black to indigo. Indigo to deep blue. Dawn creeping in slow and cold. I had never been so grateful for morning. Only when the bedroom was bright enough to see clearly did I stand up. My entire body ached from staying so still. I walked through the house, checking each window, each door. The front door had fresh scratches gouged deep around the lock. Someone had tried to pry it open. The back door had the same marks. Outside, the footprints circled the entire house. They stopped at every window, both doors. They looped around the building more than once. Big footprints, big enough to tell me whoever it was wasn't small. I followed them with my eyes to the tree line. They disappeared into the heavy woods behind the property, and I didn't dare follow. I gathered my things, shoved everything into my bags, and was out the door in under 5 minutes. I didn't even lock the cabin. I just got into my car and drove. I went straight to the nearest police station. Officers took pictures of the scratches, wrote a report. Fresh snow had already covered most of the tracks by the time they got there. They told me it was probably someone who thought the cabin was empty for the winter, someone looking to steal or shelter. They never found anyone. I didn't go back. I didn't finish my 4 weeks. I didn't ask for my money back. I just left. But here is what keeps me awake even now, years later. Whoever was out there wasn't guessing. They cleared the snow from the handle. They listened for my footsteps. They circled the house multiple times, checking every window, every door. And when the locks held, they didn't panic. They didn't run. They walked calmly into the woods like it was nothing. I never saw a face. Never heard a voice. Never found out who it was. And I know I never will. Greenleaf Copy and Print sat at the quiet dead end of a strip mall on Route 9, one of those forgotten little shops that survived more on loyalty and stubbornness than foot traffic. I had been working there for about 8 months when this happened, running the counter, helping customers print business cards and banners, and occasionally taking passport photos for people who always seemed annoyed by how they turned out. My manager, Rich Oberlin, a stocky man in his 50s who inherited the store from his father, called around noon that Wednesday asking if I could cover the closing shift. Stacy, the regular evening employee, had come down with some kind of throat infection that made her sound like gravel spinning in a blender. At 24, still chipping away at student loans from a communications degree that had yet to pay off, I grabbed any extra hours I could. The forecast mentioned snow, but nothing that sounded dangerous enough to worry about. When I pulled into the parking lot at 3 in the afternoon, the sky had that bruised, heavy look upstate New York gets before a real storm. I remember glancing at the clouds, thinking they seemed too dark for the forecast, but I shrugged it off. By 5, what the radio called a significant winter weather event had buried the parking lot in a thick white sheet. Snow fell in dense curtains, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The few cars creeping along Route 9 looked like pale ghosts drifting through fog. Rich checked in by phone, his voice cutting in and out through bad reception, reminding me that the shop had never closed early in 63 years of operation. Small-town reputation, he said. I told him I'd stick it out until 9, already calculating the overtime. The nail salon next door shut off its lights around 6, and I watched the owner sprint to her car with her coat pulled over her head before disappearing into the whiteout. After that, I had the entire strip mall to myself. The heating system kept the front area warm enough, though the back rooms, the storage area, and the old break room nobody used ran about 10 degrees colder. For 2 hours, I sat behind the counter with a paperback, listening to the wind hammer the plate glass windows and watching the snow drift higher against the doors. Not a single customer, not even a phone call. Just me, the buzz of fluorescent lights, and the storm howling outside like something hungry. Around 7, I decided to make coffee in the break room. I knew the layout by heart. The front counter took up the first third of the space, the big printers and copiers filled the middle, and behind them, a narrow hallway connected the storage room on the left, the break room on the right, and the back door at the end. A door Rich said had been painted shut for years. We got all our deliveries through the front, so no one bothered fixing it. I grabbed my empty mug and walked past the silent machines, their display screens dark. The break room was unimpressive. A mini fridge, a microwave stained inside with old spaghetti splatters, a wobbly table, 3 mismatched chairs, and a coffee maker that probably survived the Clinton years. I flipped the light, and the single bulb flickered twice before staying on. The room felt colder than usual, but I blamed the storm and the broken vent back there. As the coffee brewed, I leaned against the counter and scrolled through my phone half-heartedly, skimming an article about wrecks piling up on the interstate. The smell of cheap coffee filled the space, mixing with the musty scent old buildings collect after decades. That was when I heard it. Soft, faint, a muted thump from somewhere deeper in the building. It came from the direction of the storage room. I stopped scrolling. Stood still. Listened. Nothing. Just the coffee maker gurgling through its last cycle and the storm's muffled roar against the building. I told myself something probably fell off a shelf. The storage room was overflowing with boxes Rich never bothered to organize. I poured my coffee, added 2 sugars, and walked back to the front. The hallway looked darker than before, but I blamed that on my nerves. Passing the storage room door, I noticed it was slightly ajar, maybe an inch of darkness visible. I could have sworn it had been shut earlier. I hesitated, then pulled it closed until the latch clicked. Old buildings shift. Doors move. It wasn't worth overthinking. The next hour passed quietly. I finished a chapter of my book, checked the radar, and watched the front windows slowly shrink behind rising walls of snow. The drifts outside reached nearly 2 feet, and I began to wonder whether my old Subaru would make it out later. Around 8, boredom pushed me to stretch my legs and walk the store. But something deeper, an uneasy itch in the back of my mind, nudged me to check the storage room again. The front area was normal. The counters untouched. The display racks still neat. Snow outside swirling so thick it looked like static. I moved past the printers, listening to the old building creak under the weight of accumulating snow. When I reached the hallway, I stopped cold. The storage room door was open again. Wide open this time. A dark, rectangular mouth waited in front of me, swallowing light. The room had no windows, no natural illumination, and the only bulb inside hung from a pull chain near the center. Shadows filled everything like smoke. My heart began thudding against my ribs, but I forced myself forward, telling myself the latch must be faulty. I turned on my phone flashlight and swept the beam across the shelves. Boxes of paper, toner, old promotional signs, vinyl rolls. Everything coated in a thin layer of dust. I stepped in to reach for the pull chain. That was when I froze. Footprints. Faint but unmistakable impressions in the dust. Boot prints. Size 10 or 11 maybe. Coming from the back corner of the room toward the door. But only in one direction. Which meant whoever made them walked out and never went back. Someone else had been in the building. Maybe still was. I backed out slowly, the flashlight jittering in my shaking hand. The break room door was still closed. The back door looked unchanged at first, but when I stepped closer, I noticed fresh scratches around the latch. Bright cuts through the paint, and the door sat slightly crooked. Someone had forced it open from the outside. My legs went weak. Snow outside would have covered tracks within minutes. Whoever came in might have been inside since the storm started. I retreated to the front counter as quietly as possible, sneakers whispering over the carpet. My mind raced through the store layout, imagining every hiding place. The storage room seemed clear, the break room too small. But then I remembered the utility closet, a narrow space built into the wall between the printers and hallway. Its door blended perfectly with the paneling. You could walk past it 100 times and never see it, unless you knew it was there. I stared at that section of wall from behind the counter. I couldn't tell if the door was closed or slightly open from this distance. I didn't want to find out. I needed help. My phone signal had dropped to a single flickering bar. I dialed anyway. Static. Silence. No ring. I grabbed the landline. Dead. No dial tone. The lines must have gone down in the storm. I was completely cut off. Alone in a building with someone who had broken in, hidden somewhere for hours, watching me move around the shop unaware. A sick, crawling feeling slid up my spine. I thought about making coffee, reading my book, scrolling my phone while someone stood maybe 20 feet away, breathing quietly, waiting for something, waiting for me to be distracted, waiting for an opportunity. A sound cut through the silence. Not a thump this time. A footstep. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. Then another. Coming from the hallway. I ducked behind the counter, heart in my throat, grabbing the only thing within reach that could be a weapon, a heavy-duty paper cutter with a long metal blade. Footsteps grew louder, stopping near the printers, maybe 15 feet from me. I heard breathing. Calm. Even. A terrifying contrast to the panic crushing my chest. Through a narrow gap between the counter and wall, I saw only a sliver of floor, but enough to catch movement. Nothing. Just breathing. Steady. Patient. Then it hit me. They knew exactly where I was. They had watched me crouch. They were waiting, enjoying that I was trapped. Headlights swept across the windows suddenly, bright enough to paint the interior in pale white. A truck pulled into the lot, engine rumbling loud enough to shake the glass. The footsteps retreated fast, no longer slow, no longer confident, hurried. Urgent. I stood and ran to the front, screaming, waving my arms wildly at the truck. A bundled figure climbed out, trudging through the snow. Behind me, I heard the back door slam. The one that was supposed to be sealed shut. Then silence. I shoved the front door open against the drift and nearly collapsed into the man outside. His name was Earl, a tow truck driver looking for a safe spot to wait out the storm. He took one look at me, pale, shaking, stammering, and knew something was wrong. I told him someone had broken in. He grabbed a tire iron and helped me search the building. The utility closet door stood wide open. Inside, behind an old laminator, was a backpack. Earl pulled it out carefully. Inside were clothes, a hunting knife with a 12-inch blade, duct tape, a flashlight, and a burner phone with no contacts. A folded paper listed the shop's hours, and beneath it, a handwritten note, "Wed night." One girl alone. Earl radioed the police. They arrived an hour later, after plows cleared enough of Route 9. They took the backpack as evidence. Boot prints were found behind the building leading toward woods, but the storm filled them in too fast. No one was ever caught. I quit 3 days later. Moved back to Connecticut for a while. Even now, I think about those footprints. About the note. About how someone watched the shop long enough to know I'd be alone until 9. And I think about the hours I spent reading, sipping coffee, relaxing, while a stranger with a knife and duct tape waited in the dark, breathing quietly, 20 feet away. And I wonder what would have happened if Earl had parked somewhere else that night. Living alone had never bothered me before that winter. At the time, my name was Clara, and I'd rented a remote house miles away from the nearest town to save money and clear my head. Work was remote, life was quiet, and isolation felt like a luxury instead of a threat. Snowstorms were common in that region, and I had stocked up the way everyone told me to. The forecast mentioned heavy snow, nothing unusual, and I remember feeling almost excited for the forced stillness. The landscape outside always looked softer beneath a storm, and that morning was no different. The world around the house was already muted, wrapped in thick, weighty white, the kind that absorbs sound until everything feels suspended. Wind dragged loose snow across the yard like thin smoke drifting low to the ground. Inside, the house creaked the way old places do when temperatures drop suddenly, wood tightening and pipes settling as if the entire structure was adjusting to the cold pressing against it. By late afternoon, the storm had grown teeth. Snow piled against the doors faster than I could shovel, climbing higher each time I checked, and before long the road disappeared entirely. My phone signal flickered every few minutes before dropping again. And then, without any warning, the power died. Not a flicker, not a surge. Just a full collapse into a dense, early dusk that swallowed every corner of the house. The heater shut down with a hollow click, leaving only the faint tick of cooling pipes and my own breath fogging the air in front of me. Candles became my new light sources, their flames swaying every time the wind slammed against the siding hard enough to make the entire house shudder. I kept telling myself this was normal, just a rough storm pushing through the region, the kind that locals barely blinked at. But the silence between the gusts felt too deep, too complete, like the house itself was holding its breath. The first impact came just after dark. A dull, heavy thud against the outer wall, low enough to vibrate the bookshelf beside me. Then another. This time closer to the back of the house, sharper, like something solid hitting wood. Ice chunks falling from the roof made sense. So did debris carried by the wind. That's what I told myself. But the way the sounds repeated, irregular, spaced apart, almost thoughtful, pulled my attention every time. Each hit seemed to test a different section of the house, and the longer it went on, the more deliberate it felt. I paced room to room, listening, trying to map where the sounds came from, but the storm howled loudly enough to blur everything together, yet somehow those impacts still carved through the noise. I avoided the windows at first, uneasy about what I might see beyond the glass. But curiosity is a terrible companion in isolation, and eventually it won. Candle in hand, I approached the living room window and wiped condensation from the inside with my sleeve. Snow covered most of the glass, pressed high and tightly packed by the wind. But something darker caught my eye through a thinner patch of frost. At first, I thought it was a shadow from a drifting branch. But shadows don't spread their shape like that. The impression looked like fingers, splayed wide, pressed flat against the outside of the window, long enough to span more width than any normal hand should. Before I could fully process it, the mark disappeared as a new gust of snow slid across the pane, erasing the dark outline as if it had never existed. Moments later, another impact struck the opposite side of the house. That was when the realization settled in. Whatever was out there wasn't random, and it wasn't staying in one place. Night pressed harder after that. The candles burned lower, wax pooling unevenly at their bases as the cold crept across the floor in slow, numbing waves. The impacts continued everywhere, never constant, never patterned, just spaced out enough that I couldn't predict them, couldn't brace for them. Wind alone couldn't explain how the sounds shifted from wall to wall, as if something was circling the house, probing, moving with purpose beneath the cover of the storm. At one point, a hit landed right beside the front door, close enough that I heard snow slide down afterward like something had brushed past the siding. I stood in the hallway counting my breaths without realizing I was doing it. Every sound carried weight. Every creak felt amplified. The house that had felt cozy and sheltered for weeks now felt vulnerable, thin, almost too small to hold me safely. I checked another window, and more signs waited there. Frost scraped away from the outside in a rough oval, not by the wind, not by melting, by pressure. A second hand-shaped impression formed beside it, the fingers long and uneven, their outlines deep enough in the snow to show clear grooves. They didn't linger. Each time I got close, the marks faded as fresh snow drifted over them, hiding the evidence as if whatever made them wanted to stay unseen but not unheard. The storm acted like a curtain, and something out there knew how to use it. The banging changed after a while. It lost the chaotic energy of debris and took on something far more controlled. One strike near the kitchen. A pause, another near the bedroom. Then one at the back door. As if someone was walking the perimeter, mapping the structure from the outside. My phone finally lost signal completely, reducing what little connection I had left to a dead, glowing screen. Inside, the temperature dropped fast enough that my breath became a constant presence in front of me, a thin white cloud that floated and disappeared only to reappear with every exhale. Snow showed no footprints in the yard, not even disturbances that could be explained by an animal. But closer to the house, near the foundation, the snow shifted in unnatural ways, indentations, softened edges, places where it bulged slightly as if something had leaned close enough to disturb the drifts without fully stepping into them. Something was out there, close enough to touch the walls, but hidden well enough to stay between each gust. Eventually, exhaustion forced a decision. The safest room was the pantry, small, windowless, tucked near the center of the house. I gathered blankets, canned food, the last full candle, and shut the door behind me. The impacts continued well into the night, sometimes muted by distance, other times so close they rattled the shelves. Hours passed like that, stretched thin and jagged, until eventually the storm's roar swallowed every other noise. At some point, the impact stopped. I didn't dare open the door yet. I waited until morning, not sunrise because there wasn't one, just a gradual thinning of the darkness as the storm finally loosened its grip. I stayed inside the pantry longer than necessary, listening for anything that didn't belong. When I finally cracked the door open, the house felt wrong in a different way. It wasn't fear anymore. It was absence. A quiet so dense it felt like the house was recovering from something unseen. The air inside was bitterly cold, colder than the night before, and each step echoed sharply through the floorboards. I moved from room to room slowly, candle held ahead of me. Nothing was broken, nothing forced open, no shattered glass, no signs of intrusion. And somehow, that made everything worse. The stormlight from outside revealed the yard as a blank sheet of white, smooth, untouched, impossibly clean. But near the living room window, the snow was different, flattened in irregular patches, slightly depressed as if someone had leaned there repeatedly. The impressions were faint but unmistakable, and deeper than any drifting snow could naturally settle. I pushed open the front door with effort, the snow piled high against it, resisting like a barrier. A rush of cold air hit me, metallic and sharp, carrying with it the unnatural quiet that comes after a violent storm. The world outside looked washed clean. No tracks. No broken branches. No signs of movement in any direction. Just those faint distortions near the house, disturbances that the storm should have erased, but didn't. I stood there for a long time, exposed in the doorway, the cold biting through every layer I wore. And the one thought that bothered me more than anything was this: whatever had spent the night pressing against the house had chosen not to come inside. It had tested the walls, circled the structure, left impressions, marks, impacts, and then decided against entering. That choice, more than any threat, lodged itself into me like a splinter. When the roads were cleared later that day, I packed as quickly as numb fingers would allow and left before night had the chance to settle again. I didn't wait for explanations or comfort. The house stood silent as I drove away, just a lonely structure in the snow. But even now, years later, I replay that night in fragments, the timing of the impacts, the shifting marks, the storm acting almost like a partner to whatever moved around me. I still don't know who was out there or why the storm mattered so much to them. What I do know, what I will always know, is that something used the blizzard as cover, something that preferred to stay half hidden, and I was never meant to see it clearly.